So this is the session, and this really began for me in an article that I wrote after a couple of visits to Guam since I've been at Texas A&M. And this article came out in 2019, and I was surprised because I've written a lot of articles in lots of different journals, but this was probably the most feedback I ever got on something that people actually read. And so when you're an academic, you want to do applied research and something that's impactful. And so I started to dig into this, and I saw that this is a real balance on, we heard from all the service chiefs yesterday, and we talked about safely building projects on cost and of a high quality and on time. And we are not doing that in Guam. And one of the main, there's going to be a lot of different challenges in a place that's 13 degrees north of the equator and it's out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but some of the biggest challenges we were putting on ourselves. And so I've got this group of experts who are either from the Pentagon or there at JRM or out in the field with the ECAG. And so I'm just going to go over the very easy learning objectives here. So this is, it said intermediate level on the session, but really this is beginner. But if you just came to this and you don't have any idea what we're talking about, the DDESB is the Department of Defense Explosive Safety Board, and that is a joint board that is up at the Pentagon and has representatives from all the different services on it. And a while back, they established Guam as pretty much the same level as an active bombing range, and yet we're doing probably around $1 billion of construction there. And so you can see there's some competing requirements. To try to mitigate that risk, we have the MEC program, which is the Munitions and Explosives of Concern, and that comes with some policy directives that I think Dom and Chris are going to talk about mostly. But one of the things that I heard when I wrote the article in 2019 was, if you have a facility that's going to get built and you have spread footers, whatever the lowest disturbed area is down for the entire footprint, you had to dig up, I think, in 6-inch lifts down to across the entire space of the footprint of the facility. And in a project that already is going to be suffering from logistics challenges, this was incredibly impactful. And so it was costing months, it was costing millions of dollars, and something had to be done to make sure we're balancing the risk and productivity. So things have been done, and that's the good news about this session. I think this isn't Army versus Navy versus Air Force. This is everybody trying to put their heads together to solve this for the warfighter. And really, most of the rest of the time, I'm going to cede today to Dom and to Chris to talk about the introducing to the policy and where we're going from here primarily. Most of the meat here is at the front with Dom and Chris, but once we get through that, then I hope it's very interactive. I was at this session last year with Captain Troy Brown, who Commander Sandmel is the executive for, and I really liked that it was very conversational and people just jumped in with questions. So after we get through this first part, please feel free to jump in with questions. Dom or Chris?
All right. Yeah, I'll go ahead and kick it off. So by raise of hands, because some of this can get process heavy and rather detailed, who here knows what MEC is other than the introduction you just got a minute ago? Okay, so a good number. We will talk about MEC. We'll talk about some of the areas of improvement we're working for cost and schedule metrics. But for risk and reward, just to recap on that since that was a tagline. In my view, greatest reward is if we maintain the status quo. It's not something where we'll cross the finish line, people will exclaim, hey, we won. We just maintain what's happening. There'll still be tension between the world superpowers on the stage, but we maintain freedom of navigation, the seas and all that. On the counter side, what's the greatest risk? Well, it's that we fail in that endeavor. But when you look at risk, there's always severity and likelihood. So really, the more likely scenario is that through some of our measures, whether it deals with MEC or environmental or cultural resources, that we lose the trust of the people of Guam or some of the islands where we're doing this work. And for NAVFAC Marianas, for the non-Navy folks in the room, the Navy divides the world up into 9 regions, the different facility engineering commands. Our AOR is Guam, CNMI, but we also extend out to Republic of Palau, where we're currently doing some MILCONs for the Air Force and Federated States of Micronesia in YAP in the coming years. So, our presence there isn't necessarily guaranteed. At least in the U.S. territories it will be, obviously, but places like YAP and Palau are COFA states. basically free association with us. They used to be trust territories after World War II, but it's a choice for them on whether they want to continue that strong relationship, and there are certainly efforts by the Chinese to try to get a foot in the door. So the COFA agreement was just renewed this year, but there's always the jeopardy if we screw something up massively that we could endanger that agreement. So when it comes to MEC on Guam, and most of the things I've seen in the outlying islands where we risk some of those relationships are more in the environmental and cultural realm, but there's certainly a lot of focus from DOD and senior Navy levels on MEC because of the risk associated with damage to personnel and property. But since World War II, there have been 0 MEC-related injuries to construction on the island of Guam, which is a long period of time to go without any incidents. Up until 2010, we followed a policy called RRR. Is there familiarity with that here? So basically, recognize, retreat, report. You didn't do a whole lot of front-end planning. Went out, did construction as normal, and if you ran into something, stop the work, call EOD, and then things will be taken care of. In 2009, give or take, there was a change in the law that required former battlefields to basically follow the procedures that we would for a range and clearing. So in 2010, that rolled out as our munitions response explosive safety submission, or the MRES. Now, there have been 7 revisions to that in the last 14 years. So a lot of detailed nuance, and it changes every couple of years, and it's difficult for us, and when I say us, I'm looking at my other NAVFAC Marianas folks here in the front row, difficult enough for us to keep track of that when it's changing so often. So I'm not going to go super in-depth in the detail, but I will give you a sort of a primer here on the next few slides in how this new policy works. So if we could go on to the next. All right. So if you can see here, and I'm somewhat dating myself because the uniforms in that photo are different than uniforms we were now in the Seabees. But this is from my deployment to Guam, 11-month deployment back in 2010, 2011. And back then we operated a quarry. So bottom left you can see, and if you could designate the equipment from the background, you'd see that there was a drilling rig up on the top shelf, top right of the quarry, some heavy equipment there that we deal with. 22-ton Mack dump trucks. I mean, as someone that grew up playing with Tonka toys, this is really the closest thing you get to that in a real world setting, except they're much larger and green. So it's awesome that our CVs got to play with this stuff. They do the blasting there, so they would go to China Lake, become explosive safety trained. That's a function that I believe is largely shifted to the reserve side of our force now, but at least back then we got to play in that stuff. And did a lot of paving out there. Some of the work that we're getting ready to do here on Guam soon is also paving related. But if there's one picture that stands out as somewhat different from the rest, it's probably the bottom right one. You see an excavator there, some sheets of plywood, and a gaggle of CBs. You're probably wondering, what are they doing? But that's our segue to the next slide, which is a mech find. So back in 2010, this was about 2 months after we got there on deployment. There was a MILCON to construct a new gym on the base. And this is sort of an intro to how things used to be done. This was right about the time policies changed. But our quarry, if you're not familiar with Guam, is just tucked out of really observation fields, real close to family housing. It's about 2 blocks away from this gym where it was being constructed. And EOD needed some assistance to excavate down towards it, build up a berm, and some other things. So you see EOD up in the top frame there, and these are all photos that I took. In the middle, that is where the 1,000-pound bomb was located. And if you can see the traffic cone off to the right for scale, traffic cones maybe 2.5 feet. Overall depth of this was probably less than 36 inches. What I didn't realize at the time is that in all the years since World War II, this was the one single 1,000-pound general purpose bomb that had fallen on the island. It's actually the largest mech find to date. Since the war ended, there have been around 50 general purpose bombs that were found up through 2019, and most of them in the 100 to 500-pound range. We do find a lot of smaller ordnance, but this was one of the bigger ones. It was cleared without incident. You didn't really hear about it in the news other than a newspaper article or two, but at the time, there was the RRR process. So how it works now is a lot more front-end work. we're on Amendment 7 to this ESS, going into Amendment 8. But if you're a contractor looking to do work in Guam under one of our MACs or down the road, or maybe a CEC officer looking to head out there on orders as a construction manager, or even Air Force going up to Tinian, because they also follow a similar ESS. The area is basically mapped into likely or unlikely zones, and this is based on knowledge we have of munitions used in World War II. And if it's a likely zone, then there's a very prescribed process that we have to go through for clearing. 6-inch lifts is pretty much the norm still, but if it's an unlikely area, then you can just go with construction support on site, basically a mech-trained person, but you don't actually have to clear 6 inches at a time. But if you were to, say, just agree with what the amendment says, hey, this is a likely area, and I'm going to follow all the rules that we need to for clearing, then it's a simplified annex on the front end, because for every project you have to prepare one of these annexes to the amendment. So simplified annex gets approved at the 06 level within Guam, and it doesn't go any higher than that. But if you want to deviate from that, let's say it's an area that the ESS says is likely for mech, but you, through recent projects in the area, geotech borings, other things, believe it's unlikely, you can try to shift its classification, but that has to go up to DDSB, the Defense Explosive Safety Board. So that process has several levels of approval, and it's not always guaranteed. But if we just go along with it, then it's a simplified annex. So the standard way of doing that is basically clear your vegetation down to 6 inches above grade, and then scan for anomalies. Once you've scanned for anomalies, you prosecute those ones you find, and then you go down about 6 inches at a time. You go down 6 inches and then repeat that process. The reason that we're tied to the 6 inches, it has to do with the detection limitations of the technology we use. The target of interest that we're looking for on all these sites, sort of minimum size, is a 20 millimeter round. So 11 times the size of that target of interest is roughly the depth that we have to go through with each pass. And that's why we're constrained to such a small amount of soil at a time. And you go down until you hit design depth or until you hit bedrock. So if you're going down 6 inches at a time until you hit bedrock, sometimes that doesn't happen for quite a while. So it adds time. I'll give you just some numbers here from a quick snapshot, and I don't have more current numbers, but it is after the article that you put out. So from January 2020 to January 2022, so a 24-month period, 11 mech projects added, they were at a cost of $50 million. So 11 MILCONs, 11 mech projects on the front end. They found 2.9 million anomalies. And when I say anomaly, I just mean a metal object. It could be ordnance, it could be scrap metal, it could be a, beer bottle top. You never know. So roughly $17 per anomaly if you do the math. Of those 2.9 million anomalies, 270 of those were mech finds. So roughly 1 in every 10,000 anomalies was a genuine piece of mech. And if you do the math on that, it's $187,000 per piece of mech. That mech could have been a 20 millimeter round, could have been a 1,000-pound bomb. Most of the time, though, it's those smaller pieces. Now, there are sites, and we've got some at Anderson Air Force, where the rate of finding mech is much higher than that, but that's just a recent example of what we're seeing out there for cost. And it's come down over the years, but it's still fairly expensive. And one last point on this. So if you find mech in an unlikely area where you just had a guy on site, now you've got to stop work and potentially recharacterize that. In the past, that had gone up to the design and construction agent 1-star level for review. So for us, that's our 1-star admiral that sits at NAVFAC PAC. If this were Air Force O&M work taking place on Anderson, or like the Northfield work at Tinian, then it would go up to Air Force 1-star equivalent. After that, though, adjudication goes through NOSA and back up to, at the time, up until recent weeks, OPNAV. So if there was, say, a find in an unlikely area, our 1-star NAVFAC PAC approved it and said, yeah, I think this was just something that maybe was thrown away over the years from some folks who wanted to get home on Friday, but it's not indicative of a site that's strewn with mech. So I still want to say it's unlikely. That then goes up to NOSA, which is our Naval Ordnance Safety Administration, basically. They're one step down from DDESB, our service equivalent in the Navy. If they disagree with the one-star's determination and say, well, we think there is a genuine concern for mech, we need to change this to likely, then there's an adjudication there that needs to deconflict those opinions. And in the past, that had gone to OPNAV. So these decisions are now happening thousands of miles away in DC, can slow down the process. The recent policy changes speak to this part in particular and pushing that authority down to the field. So the middle bullet there in particular is what I'm going to talk about. Assistant Secretary of the Navy signed out a risk delegation memo here actually about a week ago. And what it allows is that adjudication pushed down to the JRM, our region commander, who literally sits at the other end of the hallway from Captain Brown and myself. So a streamlined process within it. It still has to go up to NOSA for about a week of review if there's a disagreement, but then it comes back down to us, and the local on-the-ground commander has the authority to make the decisions. They also, if we say have a job that's doing construction within the fence line, but it casts an arc outside the fence line, there's a policy gap there where we can't, or there had been a gap, where we can't enforce DoD safety standards outside the fence line. We can't make people evacuate their homes. In the 1,000-pound example I mentioned earlier for the gym, 3,000-foot radius, very close to a lot of family homes. They all had to evacuate during that clearing operation. And if you were within 3,000 to 5,000 feet, you could stay in your home, but you had to stay in your home or your workplace. You couldn't go outside. We cannot enforce that outside the fence line, even if the clearing work we're doing is right up next to the fence line. So what this allows the JRM commander to do, instead of going through a very in-depth deviation process up to the secretary level, while a lot of staff and work on paper, is to make basically a determination based on operational necessity for strategic projects to move forward and waive some of those requirements. Can't outright say we're not going to do mech clearance, but they can say, hey, we've looked at the risk, just made sure that we're not doing something obviously unsafe, like clearing during the day if there's a kindergarten across the street from this site. But if reasonable considerations are in place, we've made notifications, we can waive some of those requirements we would normally do, like actually evacuating people. So that is now a decision, again, that's at the one-star level, some of the authorities that have been pushed down. Is this going to be a night and day difference between how policy had worked? Is it going to resolve all of our delays? No, but it does get us somewhat closer within the confines that we have to work in to improving cost and time. Down the road, I'd say it'd be great, one personal opinion, if we could get to a RRR standard again, but I think unless laws were to change, that's really not within our ability at this time. But if you were to go out into the private sector, if you're a contractor and doing work not for DoD, but just out in town, say build a new hotel, or if you're Gov Guam, Guam Power Authority, Guam Waterworks Authority, they're not doing this process, they're doing the RRR process that we used up until 2010. So there is a difference there where we're holding ourselves to a higher standard, but again, to date, no injuries or fatalities related to mech in construction in Guam. So those are basically the risks there. If you've got questions on I guess risk and reward as it relates to environmental or cultural resources, some of the other things I mentioned that we encounter, feel free to bring them up in Q&A, but with that, I'll pass it to the Major.
No, I appreciate it, sir. And, definitely an honor to be on this panel with these SMEs. As a captain, like Colonel Beverly mentioned, I represent more of the tactical perspective to this problem, having been the chief of operations out of the ECAG. For those not familiar with the ECAG, it's about 275 engineers that are now in Guam, getting after a lot of the ACE Set the Theater initiatives across the CNMI and Guam as well. A lot of the work we're doing is characterized as setting up ACE power projection platforms, for instance, runways, taxiways, stores facilities, mosses, things of that nature, on World War II airfields that have been abandoned for about 80 years. So there's a lot of challenges in doing that across a multitude of domains, to include mech, environmental, logistics. You know, when I think about balancing risk and reward in that theater, probably the two biggest risks and rewards that we have are, you know, getting the construction that we need to done by, you know, that 2027 timeframe, or going too fast to where we make mistakes. You know, we create issues with the local governments or the mayors or the people of the different regions that we're operating in, and that produces delays to where you don't meet that timeline. So what I hope to do in the next couple of slides is to kind of highlight some of the successes, failures, and lessons learned that we had out there during our rotation the past 6 months. For a couple of reasons. One, you know, we've got a very diverse group here. We've got CGOs and senior NCOs that may be out there here in the near future, and giving them an idea of what they might be here to face. But in addition to that, we've got a lot of people in the industry who are getting after these problems, who are partnering with the DoD to accelerate change in the theater across all of our services. So, you know, the Air Force is one example, and this is primarily Air Force that I'll be showing, but we've got Seabees on Tinian as well that are getting after a variety of requirements that'll face very, very similar challenges that we are. An anecdote that I'll bring up, it has nothing to do with construction, but rental vehicles on Guam. So it was probably 2-3 weeks after being on ground at Tinian, and we show out to Northwest Field where they're staging all these vehicles, and they're showing up. You know, Malware happened, you know, March of 24, or in October 24. So like all the rental vehicles that are showing up are trashed and have dents in the back and paint marks all over the place. And around the corner comes this pink Toyota Tacoma that's jacked up and has the words monster on the side of it, showing up with this BPA contract, and like our jaws are dropping on the ground. Like this is the environment we're in, where it's so resource constrained across construction material and rental equipment and lodging and all those kind of things. So something to consider when you're out there, that there's going to be a lot of different challenges that you're not willing to, you're going to have to put some academic rigor and some research into to really get after them. We did end up sending the pink truck back. We tried to give it to our commander, but he wasn't super thrilled with that. But I'll start with this one. So if you've been in some of the other panels, the PDI one that happened on Tuesday, you may have seen this. So this is the center taxiway of Northfield on Tinian, and it kind of puts into perspective the amount of work required to exhume this World War II airfield that's been, you know, dormant for most of the last 80 years. The irony of this picture as well is that it has been cleared since the 1940s. This is probably 16 years worth of vegetation that's regrown on this taxiway. So what I wanted to talk about here is kind of like, what does it take to go from the left to the right? You know, it's on the Air Force side, you know, our ECAG was in AFCENT, you know, for decades, and we learned how supply chain management worked. We had different environmental parameters. We did a lot of things inside fence lines a lot of times, or with security. Northfield is an open area. It is a National Historic Landmark. You have tourists that drive through to see those National Historic Landmarks. But understanding and gaining that environmental approval was a very cumbersome progress. That picture on the left, taken October 14th, the one on the right, you know, kind of turn of the calendar year. It took us 3 months to gain that environmental approval and learn to understand how to use the Surface Deployment Distribution Command, the Army that's got the barges that move stuff around. It was very new for us, and we stood up in August of 2023. So it took a lot to get from that left picture to the right, but we identified very early on that this was a picture that we wanted to take in October, so that by the time we were done with this center taxiway, would have a very satisfying look at and be able to talk to what those things are. In the picture is Captain Matthew Bushwhacker Jacobs, as I call him. So he was the project engineer out there in the OIC that was doing tons of problem solving and working in Mission Command with the Seabees out there and sharing resources with them, which was really cool to see. We gave him the name Bushwhacker because, as you can see, all the bushwhack out there that he was having to do. That day in October, you can't drive a vehicle down the center of that taxiway on the left. And me and Colonel Brandon Balskis in the crowd are outside the truck pulling vegetation left and right to make sure that we could get through without damaging the vehicle. So lots of different challenges to do out there, and things that we'll continue to learn and overcome over the next few years as we continue that project. Here's a picture of the team out there. The team didn't get started on that clearing until January 12th, because that's how long it took to get the vehicles, that's how long it took to get bird monitors and all the archaeological monitors that are required to really operate out there. And I know some folks in the room are probably rolling their eyes, like, bird monitoring, like archaeological monitors, like, well, China's not doing that. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of airfields out in China that they've been turning in a year or 2 years, and the reality is, like, America does things differently. We conduct business differently. We're doing it in areas that, they're sovereign territories with people and governments and objectives, and I think it's our due diligence to do that, to go to these areas and to not disrupt the environment, because we're seeing in China that it's wreaked havoc in those areas and it's created issues, and they don't have the same regulations that we do. I'll pull up this one and talk about kind of the operating environments and how we used imagery like this to help inform decisions. So you can see Northwest Field in Guam, auxiliary airfield built in 1944, 1945 by Army Engineer Battalion. And on the bottom, North Field, 1945 as well, 1944, constructed by the Seabees. And when you talk about comparing left to right, this top view maybe doesn't do it justice, but these airfields were dynamited flat. They were coral bedrock that they dynamited flat, and they took excess material and they crushed it and they laid it out to create runways, and they did it very expeditiously, and the whole airfield was flat. And then when you compare that to this, where it's completely overgrown, it's kind of wild, how the jungle will overcome everything out there. But the challenge for us was, how do we know where the airfield starts and where it ends? What is previously engineered surfaces? And a way that the ECAG was able to accelerate a lot of the progress that we did was utilizing existing categorical exclusions and performing our work on pre-existing surfaces so that we could get after stuff early. And there's challenges associated with that. We got modern aircraft with modern requirements, and that's an area where the Department of Defense, and particularly the Pacific Air Forces, is taking some risk and not necessarily constructing to every absolute UFC requirement that we've had in the past, to include wingtip clearances, knowing that the purpose for these airfields isn't to project power all the time, right? Like, these are for time of need. But to do that on the engineering side, we had to understand where the airfield actually was. And when you go out there to this picture, you have no idea where it is. And I've got some pictures to show in a minute to kind of articulate runways that you can't see. But what we did, Captain Jacobs was out there. We got him on the ground in Tinian early on in October to do some of that initial investigation. And he actually leveraged his wife, who is a Navy aviator, who went down to the National Historic Archives and pulled out maps to show what it looked like. And we used those. We used pictures, as you see on the left, to show what was asphalt, what was crushed coral, because not everything was paved in asphalt. They were being shot out by the Japanese in Northwest Field, and there's some pretty cool articles that talk through how it was constructed that we leveraged. But we used images like this to articulate, like, what are we not able to see that can help us better inform and buy down on risk on how we should plan and construct some of these infrastructure requirements that we have. Here on the left is kind of some on the ground shots of what North Field looks like in Tinian. And the couple of pictures that I'll kind of highlight, on the left you got a downed tree with Captain Matthew Bush Wacker Jacobs and Master Sergeant Acevedo, who is the superintendent out there. And this is one of many, many, many humongous trees that are all over North Field. And some of them, there's different species and different levels of environmental restrictions that we have out there. And what does that do to the pavement? What does that do to the base course and the subgrade as well? Were challenges that we had to incorporate into a lot of the designs we did. Another one, the starred picture in the middle, kind of hard to see, and I don't think I have a laser pointer, but kind of dead center on that picture is 2 full-length 8,000-foot runways. That in order for us to do progress, we have to remove all of that vegetation and exhume those previously disturbed areas so that we can put pavement down. Conservatively, we think that there's 20,000 tons of green waste that needs to be addressed on Northfield before we can call, IOC of the airfield done and do that paving. So this is the type of scope that you can expect not only at Northwest Field and Northfield, but future operating locations that are very, very similar. There's challenges in terms of the disposal of that material that we'll have to overcome as well, both on the DoD side and the contractor side, because we do have lots of contractors that are doing similar scope work out there. To kind of talk about discovery, I'll use an anecdote. The picture kind of dead center in the top and the bottom. So that's south ramp on Northfield, and this was a ramp that we had initially identified as a spot for an asphalt batch plant, and we thought it was approximately 3 million square feet, which would be just ample space for us to put a batch plant. And we get out there, and after we get the approval to do so, and we start clearing it, and we realize that there was never asphalt there to begin with. We also realized that it's about the third of the size that we thought it was going to be. And through that discovery and using some of those images that we had, we were able to pre-identify before we even go out and start clearing, we suspect that there may be this type of material there, and have that inform our decisions, have that inform whether we start that pavement earlier or do it later. So on the bottom right, there's a picture of a bird monitor. So you wouldn't imagine how important this bird monitor is. Kind of early on during our time there, it was a constrained resource that was being used by the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines and exercises. And we got them for about 2 days a week. And that is what controlled our pace as to what we could clear, because that bird monitor has to check for endangered species and ensure that we're not gonna create any issues from an environmental standpoint. So it's amazing the amount of moving pieces that are required. The great news is we've got lots of engineers and equipment operators ready to get out there and remove a lot of it. And we've had a great success in elevating a lot of the issues that we've had, both the PACAF, A4C, and beyond, to kind of help get us the resources that we need and to get after more progress. I like to bring this up as well. One of the topics that was discussed on Tuesday was there's a lot of engineering that has to be done here. Understanding that crushed coral was the material used to create the base course back in 1945, and they used a lot of it, and it's got varying states of quality throughout the CNMI, especially at Northfield. So this is the kind of testing that we had to do in the conditions. That starred picture is one of our airmen doing DCPs on a runway that is just completely overgrown with vegetation, and understanding how we take that data and leverage contractors throughout all of our operating locations to help us inform those designs and make decisions that can get the construction done as quickly as possible, as well as ensuring safety and providing the right design for those surfaces out there. Talked a lot about tinning, and I know some of the other panels and briefings that we had at the all-call. General Miller discussed a lot of what we're doing at Northfield. Also doing quite a bit of work at Northwest Field. We've been there a little bit longer, able to get some of the environmental wickets and understanding the environment out there. So we were able to place the first bit of asphalt by troop construction labor for the EKG out on Northwest Field. And a lot of this work is orchestrated around creating capability, creating an apron connected to a taxiway, connected to a runway, so that we can have initial capability for race operations. And so by the time we left, we were very, very close to having that initial IOC. But there's, despite some of the delays and the slowdowns that we've had at some of these locations, we've been able to balance risk and reward in places like Northwest Field. I'll draw your attention to the top right picture. That's a ramp with almost no shoulder, right? Like, we're used to seeing lots of shoulder removed and vegetation removed so that we can have wingtip clearance, so we don't clip the trees and all that kind of stuff. It takes a better part of 2 years in order to get that environmental approval to work off surface. So we worked as close to off surface as we can, and that's where we're keeping it for the time being until we get that approval. But we're not letting that restriction slow our progress down. We're just working within the parameters of what we're able to do to move fast. Last couple slides. I know I want to make sure that we've got plenty of time for questions, but here we've got some case spans. I know yesterday in the Air Force all call we talked about RIB-SIP a little bit, so regional based preposition assets, which is kind of a WRM flavor of assets that'll be used for ACE Con Ops. These type of requirements are going to be all over the theater. Case bands, which I know a lot of different services construct, they take a long time to procure that material in the States. We're down in Hurlburt in fairly close proximity to MIC Industries, and it takes forever to get that material. And using UBMs is a very challenging piece of equipment to calibrate, and there's a lot of challenges with that. But this requirement's not going to go away, whether it's case bands or PEBs or some other sort of structure, in order for us to pre-position that. And this is probably the one area I could see MEC becoming an issue in some of the locations we go at, because we won't always have the luxury of constructing a case band on an old apron. We might have to remove some vegetation, and we might find ourselves in that issue with MEC in order to get some of those clearances. But I'll kind of close with this last picture. So on the left, you've got a picture of Army aviation engineers on Saipan that are doing some debris clearance post them occupying Saipan for a period of time back then. And then on the right, you've got a picture of RV3 from the 513th ERHS getting one of their first pieces of equipment. These pictures were taken probably ballpark 80 years apart, and we're on a very, very similar area. So it's really cool to see the expeditionary engineering side of things kind of getting back into that theater. And I think kind of what I would say in closing is balancing risk and reward is a part of every services, every contractor that's going to be out there for the foreseeable future, because there's so much risk in what we do, and there's so much risk in what we don't do and what we're not able to do quickly out there in order to kind of meet the objectives that we have. But I'll kind of close there and open
Can you
it
go
back
one
up
more
to-
slide?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've been noticing we've Frankensteined a lot of different slides from a lot of different sources together, and so that was probably the most Red Horse or EKEG or other things that you'll see on NAVFAC slides. But it just speaks to the collaboration that we have here across the range. We've kept it very lady and gentlemanly, but this has not been without controversy, and so that's one of the things that I guess I would say maybe to Dom or Chris, or especially if we have questions out there in the audience. I know that it's one of those things where I'm 100% certain that there's 0% wrong with this, even with the new amendment that's been signed out. And so if you have questions and you want to ask anything spicy or caliente, whatever you want. So yeah, go ahead, Dom.
So having been through a couple different seminars here, the warfighter panel, I sat through the other Air Force, the runway construction panel. There's a lot of nuances to this. So you heard when he talked about MEC applies to installations, and then the authorities on the installation and the authorities off installation. When we talk about some of these other islands, CNMI being a territory of the United States, the U.S. laws apply, but their governor has some leeway and controls and influence. And then you talk about the COFA, the Compact of Free Association Nations, the Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Republic of Marshall Islands. Different agreements. A lot of our federal rules apply. FEMA applies. EPA technically applies. I say technically because there are some nuances to that. So the discussions about MEC at other locations, and also on the COFA, in the COFA nations, there's actually, I forget what the term is. I don't know if PACOM. The DOD controlled property, there's DOD plots of land that are marked that DOD has access or control over. What is there a term?
Yes, defense cooperation sites.
Defense cooperation sites that DOD has access to. And then there's other areas that we don't. So sometimes we do construction in them, sometimes we do construction outside of them. So again, inside certain rules apply, outside certain rules may not apply. So every situation is going to have a little nuance difference to it. And for the sake of the tactical operators on the ground, you've got to work your way up your chain of command up through that first appropriate level. If it can be resolved within the commands in Guam, great. If it's got to go up to the Air Force component back in Hawaii, fine. It can go up to Indo-PACOM, the combatant command. They have all the operational authorities in that entire area of responsibility, that whole Indo-Pacific region. And then if they have a problem, they call the Pentagon. So, again, so the fact that I didn't even realize that the thing was signed last week. So that's great. At least the ASN signed a memo last week. So that's progress towards some advancement. But just remember, so when you're doing these projects, it's going to start on clearly the planning starts at the government side, what we're going to build or what we want to build and where we're going to build it. And then that's when all the analysis of what applies and what doesn't apply comes into play. And then when MEC does apply and it does go out to a contractor, then you've got to have that dialogue with the contractor so they truly understand what they're getting involved in and what their risks are versus the government risks. But just keep that in mind so that that whole what issue is at hand, who's got that authority. In the case of MEC, the new letter has pushed some of that decision making, or at least initial decision making, down to the lower level. From the Pentagon level, in the J4, we have the J4 3-star currently general, a vice J4 2-star admiral, and we have a senior executive. Senior executive, Mr. Kelleher, was out in Guam, and Tinian, I think he went to Saipan too, out there, walked some of this, trying to understand the situation, trying to understand it, at least in these locations. And then came back and met with the senior executive at DDESB to try to talk about, let's discuss this risk and where does that risk fall. I think that led to kind of pushing the Navy to maybe to go ahead and at least take this one step. If it's not an amendment number 8, at least it's a step in that direction. The Pentagon perspective is just giving top cover. I'm pointing to the Indo-PACOM, one of the Indo-PACOM engineers in the room. Giving top cover to Indo-PACOM so they can be set to do what they may be asked to do if ever needed in the Pacific, which all trickles all the way down to that Air Force engineer on the ground who's actually whacking bush. But the urgency of that, so trying to balance that urgency with the real life and death risk that comes into play. I mean, people that lived in Europe, years ago stationed in Germany. One day we all evacuated because they were repaving a parking lot, and when they were repaving a parking lot, they uncovered a 500-pound bomb. So they paved over a 500-pound bomb years ago, and then they had to repave, and they found it. So this happens around the world in some of these cases. So in these cases, that analysis of was it a battlefield or not? In the case of Tinian, are you dealing with MEC on the airfield?
So
or as a policy?
As a policy, my understanding is yes, sir, but we have not yet had to deal with that based on the kind of level of effort in which we're constructing right now.
But in some of these cases where you constructed over it, anyway, the authorities are in place, the decision making, some of it is being pushed down. You just have to know that process, and if you're operating there as a uniformed engineer or a contractor, once it gets to a contractor, it should be clear, if that makes sense. The uniformed folks, I would offer, it's not always clear, like you're saying. It's not always clear when you're in uniform. You just get told, hey, go build this project, and all of a sudden, now you got to worry about birds, now you got to worry about this, and then you worry about this thing called MEC, and on and on and on. So I just wanted to make that kind of broad, confusing statement.
I appreciate that. I think that's great. So I'll launch it with any questions that we have. We have a great turnout here this morning. Are there any questions? Jim can help you. And I just want to take a moment to say thanks to Jim, retired Senior Master Sergeant, and Joseph doing the audio. I see a question up here.
From Space Command. Chip on U.S. Space Command. Quick question on the NEPA process. Who is handling that, and how far removed are they from your job site? So I saw the guy that was handling the birds. You talked about archaeological potential conflicts there as well. Having done projects that have been associated with the NEPA process, I'm just curious how that worked.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, sir, the ECAG is not handling the environmental and NEPA across the broad spectrum of the environmental, bird monitoring, the natural resources side of things, the archaeological side of things. So PACAF A4C has assembled a team via contract to support that, and most of them sit in a kind of an A4C forward position on Anderson, and they support both Northwest Field and Tinian as time permits. There's also been partnership with Joint Region Marianas to do some of the monitoring as well, with some positions that have been hired there. Our NEPA specialist who works all the NEPA stuff actually sat at PACAF A4C in Hickam. He processed a lot of the stuff, and being in closer proximity to some of those environmental agencies that sit at Hawaii, he handled a lot of that. So Currently not in the kind of the portfolio of the EKIC itself, but being addressed in coordination with the A4C.
And I'll add on to that. So Guam itself, all the DoD land is owned by the Navy, so NAVFAC has a role in NEPA, at least once we get to the post-award phase. For some of the projects in the islands, like Palau, the Air Force funded the upfront EIS there, but in award we're administering it. So the bird monitors, we send those TDY from Guam. In fact, we just hired an additional one, or approved the hiring of it a week or two back. It is really where we see the rub there is the bottleneck with the local authorities. So EPA rules to apply out there, so we work with Guam EPA, but they're a small office. You know, the entire island is only 30 miles long, 160,000 people. So when you look at just their organic capabilities on the island, their construction force on the island, about 4,500 people. So most of the construction we bring in to work these DoD jobs are H-2B laborers from the Philippines. Likewise, their GIPA or Guam EPA office, pretty constrained. We have a prioritization list to help push stuff to the top that needs to be. These days, most of the stuff that we push to the top is related to Guam Defense System. But we can't outright put an AFAC employee in the EPA office to process our own paperwork. What we have done is hire contractors to assist in that, though. So we have several contractors that we've hired who sit there and help process the paperwork. They're not signing on the bottom line, but we've been doing that for at least a year now in Guam, and we just approved similar positions for Palau and the CNMI to help move things through.
There's a question. Allie has a question back there, Jim.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Fryman from Ramstein. So to quote the famous nature documentary Jurassic Park, nature finds a way. So now that we're doing all this combat landscaping, as I like to call it, how do we assure on these areas that we aren't maybe having a permanent presence that doesn't come back? And if it does, how do we document it so we don't have to go through as many hoops and processes as you all have been talking about during this time?
So great question. If you're from the NAVFAC realm, you know a lot of our big policy instructions have a P number in front of it, P73 or 83. One of those is our real estate manual. So there is a P50, which was a study done on munitions in World War II on Guam that documents the ordnance used in various areas. But that's only as good as the record keeping at the time. So in general, that's why most of the island is viewed as likely to have mech. But the JRM region, J3 shop maintains a database of all that. And whenever, actually I should say for any project, whenever there's a mech find, there's an after action report that has to be done. That goes up to NOSA and others, but it also gets logged with our JRM explosive safety folks. So from the history of all our finds, I can tell you a couple more statistics. 70% of all the mech finds are in the first 6 inches of soil. Many of them closer to the surface than that. And 95% of all the finds are in the top 30 inches of soil. So as we do more of these clearing operations, our data gets better. You know, we get more fidelity on, hey, even though this area shows is likely, we've done enough related adjacent work to know that really it's pretty clean in there, or maybe the opposite case might be true.
When you started going down the P path, I thought maybe you were going to say we just mostly use PFAS and napalm. But, so, I don't know. That's the next article.
Hey, good morning. My name's Bill Grip. I'm with MVP, but in full transparency, I was the MEC program manager there for 14 months, back starting in 2020. So lived the NOSA dream every day, and so happy to hear V8 is on the horizon, because we talked about V8 3 years ago. But progress is being made. Question, at that time when I left, we were talking about how to better pre-characterize the sites and the use of AGC selectively and the cost of doing that. Because as you guys know, contractors are going to bid to the risk, and I think we told them anywhere from a 1 to 100,000 anomalies could be found on any site, and they were bidding that way. So it was almost impossible for them to characterize the risk, and therefore the Navy was paying for it. Has any movement been made on convincing the powers that be that AGC or some similar technology ought to be funded and brought to the island selectively to at least address some of the perceived higher risk sites.
So we do get that recommendation from some folks, and I don't know if you have similar knowledge on this or not, but the terrain there in these jungle environments is just as jungle looking on Guam as it is in Tinian. So when you clear it down to 6 inches, it can be hard to get some of that technology in there, and you're still limited by the detection depth. So when your target of interest is 20 millimeter round, my understanding at least is even those advanced technologies can't get much further than 7, 8 inches to find that small of a round, unless you know some specific ones that differ. But at least for advanced pre-characterization of the soil, one thing that I glossed over in the slides, but Amendment 8, to your point, it's been in the works for a while. It's probably changed a lot since the draft you've seen, because we've gone back and forth with NOSA on a lot of the wording changes. But the in situ soil horizon, or basically when you get to native soil, that is one change in the draft amendment, which is hopefully signed out soon. So let's say your design depth is 5 feet, 60 inches, but your geotech boring shows that you get down to native soil at 30 inches. Well, with some of the new provisions that this Amendment 8 could allow, we could be finding ourselves in a situation where we only have to do the 6-inch lifts down to 30 inches, and then beyond that, we can just do normal excavation to get the design depth to 60. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Colonel Borland.
Thank you very much. Colonel Borland, SOCOM. One of the questions I have revolves around risk and how we're making assessments back up. You said the 27 date, which we're all familiar with. There's some other dates out there. But as you're talking about essentially the pace of construction, when do we pick up speed? I mean, this is a race. So like when do we have to take more risk in the here and now to start to pick up pace, or are we going to not meet objective based off the current pace we're getting at?
So I think a lot of that's from the funding perspective, and you've probably got better insight on that, Don.
Money's always first, but getting around some of these policies, now we're going interagency.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all DOD's authority in some cases. Inside an installation, we have, I'll say, a lot of authorities, but the environmental still apply. So when you get into each nation's cultural issues, I mean, I was out in Hawaii for years, and to this day, you still have cultural issues on bases that we've been on for decades. And every time there's a new project, some new cultural issue pops up. That doesn't change, and that's what starts crossing streams between Department of Defense and outside. Within Department of Defense, we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
But Department of Defense doesn't have the final answer. And then if you go to another nation, now you get Department of State's involved, and that's the challenge. That becomes the challenge. And like mentioned, World War II, before the war started, the Navy was out there blowing up coral reefs, including in Hawaii, scooping up the coral to make a runway for seaplanes, and then dumping it on the land, making an island, let alone making airfields.
I think that's what I'm alluding to.
We're caught in. We have those discussions in the Pentagon, but the red tape that exists there still exists. So it's a matter of the new construction authorities. So we had other discussions in the other panel about new construction authorities for $15 million and below. That can be made at the Indo-PACOM level as long as money is available, which gets small stuff, which can get after some ACE scale work. Mm-hmm. The authorities, but that's a huge change for Congress to allow DOD to just start building stuff in other locations without congressional approval, let's just say. So there are little nuance bits and pieces of this that have progressed to the point where we can go faster. But all this shift to PDI and PDI itself, it didn't necessarily come with any money. So we wrote into it. We wrote a policy from the national security strategy down and to shift to the Pacific. It didn't come with money. So money is still a challenge. But anyway, so you got layers. You got them. We still need the money. You've got some construction authorities to do some smaller stuff, and then you got host nation issues and what have you.
Just one follow-up, if I could. Are the mechanisms being put in place? As we started looking, moving out of CENTCOM and one of my former gigs, looking into INDOPACOM, what we saw was there weren't mature mechanisms in that to even get after the money once it was there. We're talking all the appropriate boarding processes and stuff necessary. Are we seeing those being better in place in INDOPACOM so that we can grab the money once it starts to flow through the command?
You can ask the INDOPACOM engineer right there, but go ahead. Derek.
Yeah, I would say that processes are ever changing and evolving. I would say, I think from an INDOPACOM perspective, certainly the requirements and the plans are definitely constantly being refined and getting better from the service components, right? But it's really, I'd be looking to the service components, right, to tell me what their requirements are. And then I think the funding is there, like Dom said. So great support in the FY24 appropriations for unspecified minor military construction. In the President's budget for 25, about triple the amount that we're looking at in 24. So a lot of money coming down the pike there. And I think Congress has expressed extreme desire to be supportive. And so definitely one of the things I want to talk about for MEC, I'd be more interested in what law was enacted that made the change back in 2010, because we've gotten a lot of questions from the SASC about why we're not waiving MEC on Guam. And so I think that there might be some energy there to perhaps change the law, but that's something we can talk about offline. But
I appreciate this. I just want to express my thanks to Colonel Beverly and Captain Moore and Commander Sandmel and Colonel Sporazio. I have one last slide here that is just a shameless plug for Texas A&M University. Can you show the video? Our president is retired Chief of Staff General Mark A. Welsh III. Our director of the Bush Combat Development Complex is retired Major General Tim Green, who was there for civil engineering until 2018. And then I'm there. So if anybody else would like to go to Texas A&M, we are creating what I like to call Tony Stark's playground out at the Rellis campus, which is an acronym for our core values of respect, excellence, leadership, loyalty, integrity, and selfless service.